Hi. How's everybody doing? I mean, all right. That's it? All right. We can cheer in a library, it's allowed. My name's Aiden Flax Clark. I'm the director of Live from NYPL. So I am thrilled to see all of you here and anyone watching online. Thank you very much for joining us. You all are all here for the first event of Live from NYPL for the fall. So thank you very much. I mean, it deserves a, yeah, there you go. Let's irritate some people trying to read upstairs. What do you think? I always want to start a library podcast called Shh, and everyone thinks it's a terrible idea, but I still think it's very good. So yeah, this is the first event of the fall, and we have a ton of great things happening. In the days and weeks ahead, we're going to be joined by Connie Chung, Gary Marcus, Richard Powers and Marlon James, U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limon, the founder of Well Read Black Girl, Gloria Steinem, climate scientist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, and many, many more. We're also going to be doing, I think for the 7th year, our annual Halloween costume contest, judged by Tim Gunn and librarians. The funnest night of the year at the library. And if we all manage to survive the election, we will close out the year with a very special event, the Library After Hours, dedicated to James Baldwin, who is the subject of a fantastic new exhibition up at the Schomburg Center in Harlem, and also a special section of treasures downstairs. Hopefully you're all on our newsletters, but if you're not, you can go to this very hard URL, nypl.org/newsletter, and sign up for it. There's one called Connect and one called Events. That will be the place to get everything that you need to know about what's coming up, and you'll be the first to sign up for things. But on to tonight. Clara Bingham's new book is The Movement: How Women's Liberation Transformed America. It's a comprehensive and frankly riveting oral history of a critical decade in the history of feminism. And it's a really fantastic read, and hopefully you all bought it on the way in, yes? Okay, well if you didn't, you have another chance to buy it on your way out. And I believe Clara will be signing books afterward, is that right? Probably right out there, so I really can't encourage you enough to do so. And we are thrilled that she's joined by journalist and author Farai Chideya. You have their bios in your programs, so please take a read. They're gonna talk, I believe, about Betty Friedan, who happened to write The Feminine Mystique in this building. Do you know that? Yeah, I mean, people have mixed feelings about that book, but it is what it is, and it was written right here in this building, which is pretty amazing, so we're really think this is the perfect place to be hosting this conversation. Okay, so you got note cards when you came in. Those are for answering questions. Sorry, not answering, asking questions. I mean, I suppose you could answer them, but that's not going to be very valuable, is it? You can write your questions down. We'll come by to collect them during the talk. If you're watching online, you can put your questions in the chat. We'd love to hear from you wherever you are. Clara will answer some of them at the end of tonight's conversation. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course everyone here. So thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for being here, and please let's give it up for Farai Chideya and Clara Bingham.
Hello.
Hey, folks. I have to say, I absolutely adored this book. Clara, I just loved it to bits. I listened to the audio version, but I'm glad to have the paper version because you have copious notes and material about what you did. So you start the book. I'm going to ask you about your process and how you decided to do this book, but let's start where the book starts, which is The Feminine Mystique, which we just learned was actually written here.
Amazing.
Written and researched here. But why did you start with The Feminine Mystique?
It was really a question of chronology because I decided that this is such a big story that the only way to tell it that can make sense is chronologically. And I could have started in 1961 with the President's Commission on Women, which was very important, but their first report came out in 1963. And so did the Equal Pay Act, which was 1963, and the feminine mystique. And I understand that the feminine mystique has since been, in many ways, criticized for a lot of good reasons, because it came out in the height of the civil rights movement. And Betty Friedan did not mention race at all. And in fact, the main point of her story, which was she took a poll for the 15th reunion of her Smith class of 1945, and everyone was a white, middle-class, obviously educated woman in that poll. And when she discovered that all of them were living in the suburbs post-World War II, and living this domestic perfection that they were supposed to be living up to, advertised, of course, by Madison Avenue, and that they were all miserable and had the problem that had no name. And Betty, too, was miserable living. She was a housewife living in Westchester and a frustrated writer. Her answer for this is, well, if someone can take care of your kids and clean your house and you can go to work, then you might be able to be happy. But who would be doing that? Women of color and women in lower, who might not have had the privilege that Betty Friedan and her Smithies had. So she seemed to be in that book completely, oblivious to what was going on in the rest of America. And yet it sold 3 million copies, and it really, in terms of white women who read it, it had a huge impact on beginning what would be a sort of much longer, train of change.
So what do you admire about the book? And then I want to see if you can read us a little bit from your book about the feminine mystique, or maybe you don't admire it.
I found it pretty unreadable. It's very dense. There's a lot of sociology in it. It's big and fat. I was actually incredibly surprised that it sold so well, and wonder if people were just really reading the excerpts. But she caught the zeitgeist, and it was very much a portrait of, white, middle-class, college-educated women in the 50s. And she had all these amazing statistics, like 60% of college-educated women dropped out to get married. 6-0. And what she did was she documented the backslide, that before the war, women were educated in larger numbers, getting married later, and having fewer children. Post-war, all of that changed. And so that, I thought, was an important, I think that was the benefit of the book, was it sort of focused in a pretty laser way on what had changed since World War II for women, for some women.
Can you read us a little bit from your section on the feminine mystique?
Yes, I will. We'll be reading from the critics. The first person I'm quoting here is a woman named Barbara Smith, who I interviewed, and who you'll find out who she is later. But this is what she told me about the feminine mystique. I could not figure out for the life of me what something called women's liberation would be. I could not even wrap my mind around it, because it's like, white women? What do white women have to complain about? White women had been the bane of black women's existence, including the black women in my family, all of whom had done domestic work, whatever education level they had, and my family was pretty highly educated. Our mother was the only one who went to college, but my aunt was a high school graduate and was the salutatorian of her class in Cleveland, Ohio in 1932. I mean, these are some really smart people, yet all they did was domestic work, and they would tell us the horrors that they had experienced at the hands of white women. Another black woman I interviewed, the famous, brilliant Margot Jefferson, told me this. Historically, I respected Betty Friedan's contribution, genuinely. By the time I came to feminism, I was much more interested in the more daring and radical paths. Betty Friedan, in that way, was very much bound to certain strictures of class and of race, and of an integrating into the existing power systems. So that's what I thought. It was a historical marker. And I would say that was really the reason why I started with it.
Yeah, yeah. You cover decades in this book. It's broadly about second wave feminism, but some of the people in the book really are generationally different from each other. And there are people of wide renown in this book, like Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm, both of which I'll ask you about later in this talk. But you also have people who are not known publicly, or if so, barely at all. How did you decide, first of all, to write this book, and secondly, who would be in it?
I decided to write it because my previous book, Witness to the Revolution, was an oral history narrative, just like this one, of the last year of the 60s, the school year of the 60s. And it covered different movements for social change, and had one chapter on feminism. And when I was writing that chapter, I realized, oh, this needs to be its own book. And this was the movement that made such an enormous impact on so many people, on half the population. And it's had such lasting significance, and no one's getting any younger. So after I finished Witness, I started as soon as I could on the movement, and I interviewed about 120 women, mostly women, some men as well, and was happy to get to them. Their ages ranged from about 75 to 95. So that alone, getting to everyone, was really important, but figuring out who to get to was basically a really interesting reporting challenge. I decided what events I cared about, and then needed to find the characters and the people who made them. I only wanted people who were on the front lines of change, who were the warriors, I didn't interview historians and pundits or a current feminist. This was really about what was it like on the ground, and what was it like to have your life change. And the reason why I was happy to do this as an oral history is because at that time, the personal was political. That was such an important catchphrase. And it's so true, because this was a revolution that took place in the bedroom and the boardroom and on the factory floor. And it was everyone that I talked to had enormous transformational personal change in their life during this 10-year period. And I went from one to another. Every person I interviewed, I asked them for names of who I could talk to next, and it was about building trust and finding people who would trust me with their stories. So it was a little bit haphazard, and would depend a lot on luck.
Well, I was impressed with how intersectional this book is. You really have a lot of deep understanding of the intersections of race, gender, sexual orientation, class in here. And there's a section with Pauli Murray talking about how they really began to understand gender in isolation when they were going to Howard Law School. So the race issue should have been, off the table, but then the gender issue came to the fore. And they said, so what I'm really saying is that removing the racial factor, Howard University being a school where the racial factor was not the problem, immediately the sex factor was isolated. And an experience of learning really for the first time what a crude kind of sexism can be, an unvarnished one. And so this is the beginning of my conscious feminism at Howard University in the 40s. How did you seek out stories from people like Pauli Murray, Flo Kennedy, as well as more contemporary figures like Margot Jefferson that really outlined the intersectionality of these issues?
I I tried with Flo Kennedy, for example, who was a civil rights lawyer and was younger than Pauli Murray, but an incredibly important engine for this movement. I had to use archives, and it was very hard. Especially Flo Kennedy, I was very frustrated by how little there was on her, and also how little there was later on the National Black Feminist Organization, which I end the book with. It started in 1973, very hard to find oral histories that had been, I relied a lot on colleges that had conducted oral history, campaigns essentially. Smith and Radcliffe had very good sources on that front. Same with the Library of Congress. And Smith did a better job of finding the foundational Black feminists in time, but Flo Kennedy died pretty early, and Pauli Murray did too, of course. So it was just more of a struggle than it should have been. To find their voices. With Margot Jefferson, she lives here in New York, and I was able to convince her to talk to me. And other women, Barbara Smith was also really important. She's a very important person in this book. She was an academic and went to Mount Holyoke. She was the first class of Black women admitted into Holyoke. And she has a twin sister, Beverly, and they founded the Combahee River Collective later in 1974 and introduced me to members of that collective, like Margot Akazawa Ray, who's in the book, and several other women. So it took a lot of, I had to really gain their trust. And so it wasn't as easy as a white woman to get them to agree to bare their souls, which was what I really wanted people to do.
Yeah. What do you have an estimate of what percentage of the material came from archives, particularly from people who've been deceased, and what percentage came from new interviews? Because it's all great, but it's challenging, I'm sure, to mix those two as well.
That's a really good question. I'm guessing it's probably 20 or 30% were archival. And in some cases, because I was asking people to remember things that happened to them 50 years ago, which is really challenging, I would then also try to back up those interviews with anything archival I could find. And for example, the Smith and the Radcliffe oral histories, many of the women I interviewed also had done those interviews in the 90s.
Right.
So they were much fresher, and I would often really rely on them, sometimes more than my interview. Mm-hmm. And also for women who refused to talk to me, like Judy Chicago. Don't get me started. Luckily, she'd given a lot of interviews here and there and wrote a memoir. I also relied on memoirs, some people, but it had to be first person.
Right. Yeah, it's really gripping. There's so many thematic threads in the book. One of them is the law and the ways that laws change over time in terms of what women can access. What were some of the aspects of the law? I want to talk about abortion separately as its own thing, but what aspects of the law really caught your attention?
Well, the most important early piece of legislation that changed everything was Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So that was passed in 1964, famously introduced by a white segregationist man named Howard Smith from Virginia, who was not for the bill at all. And what he did last minute on the House floor was Title VII of this amazing omnibus bill that put an end to Jim Crow, and in many different ways. Title VII was for employment, and it stated that you could not discriminate in employment on the basis of race, nationality, or creed. No mention of gender, of course. And Howard Smith inserted sex into that list, and it was considered a joke. Everyone laughed about it. A lot of the men got up who were very much the big Democrats, like Emanuel Seller was one of the big civil rights Democrats. He was a congressman from Brooklyn. And he just thought this was terrible and a terrible joke. But a lot of women who were working behind the scenes wanted to do the same thing, but when Howard Smith did, who was the chairman of the Rules Committee, they realized, let him introduce this, and it passed. And it also, that Title VII is what started the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission the next year. And I interviewed this fascinating woman who was in her 90s named Sonia Fuentes, who was the first lawyer. Eileen Hernandez, who is no longer alive, but she was one of the commissioners. So those two women were taking in huge amounts of complaints. A third of the complaints came from women that first year. So that law really got things started and was what sparked the formation of the National Organization for Women in 1966. But the person who understood the value of the law the most was Pauli Murray, because Pauli Murray in 1964 was getting I noticed you call her they. This is an interesting thing. I was torn about how to identify her.
Well, she was a her during much of her life.
Yes.
And then seems to identify as a they.
As a they, yeah. So Pauli Murray was at Yale Law School getting her PhD in law. She was brilliant and realized, she wrote this very, very important, I'm just gonna say she because it's easier and I'm gonna get it wrong.
And I think more contemporaneous to
the time.
The time.
Yeah. She wrote a very important law review article with Catherine East, who was an interesting legal staffer, called Jane Crow and the Law, where she explained how intersectional it was between the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. And she was 20 years ahead of Betty Friedan or anyone else, because she had come to this new consciousness in the 40s at Howard Law School. So this was a really important work that was passed all over Congress and helped get Title VII, helped keep sex in Title VII.
Yeah.
But later on, Title IX and the ERA passed in 1972. Both of them, especially Title IX, was incredibly important. And that's a fascinating part of the book.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And Title IX, has many applications, but often gets cited in terms of sport and how it affected sport. And I just loved the sports section in your book about women, Billie Jean King and the Battle of the Sexes, but also the first woman to run a marathon.
Bobby Gibb.
Yeah, how did you decide to put that in? And tell us a little bit about her. It was such a fun section.
I'm so glad. She was one of my favorite interviews. She lives in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and is a sculptor, and she was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon in 1966. It was completely illegal. She was not timed. She jumped out of a bush at the starting line. Yeah. She had trained in nurse shoes because they were the only shoes she could find that were wide enough and had enough cushion. And she was a natural runner and had run way more than 26 miles. But of course, women at the time had been warned by their doctors that it was dangerous to exert themselves that much because their uteruses could fall out. And so Bobby decided she was willing to take the risk. And she describes getting to the point in the marathon, which is an important turn in the marathon. I think it's about halfway, when it was at Wellesley College. And the students had heard on the radio that a woman was running in the marathon, and they came out and started screaming. And Bobby tells the story that one young woman started singing Ave Maria, and that was this moment when she realized she wasn't just doing it for herself, because she wasn't involved in the women's movement at all. This was just a natural urge she had to need to be who she wanted to be. And she realized that she was representing an entire gender. and that she'd resented that women were considered weak, physically weak, and that this was this huge moment. She finished 2/3 ahead of the rest of the pack, and the word went out all over the world. It was a huge piece of news.
Yeah, it was a really fun section to read. Also that she got bad blisters on her feet because she wanted to run in shoes that looked more masculine.
Right, exactly.
Than the
Her
nurse's
brother's
shoes.
shoes.
So she could have probably pulled an even faster time. And there's always a question of who gets to tell the stories of women and feminism. And in this book, you have a variety of illustrative examples of where media was used or media sometimes abused women. And so you have Gloria Steinem talking about the birth of Ms. Magazine, which has now passed its 50th anniversary. And Gloria is someone who's personally very dear to me. I took her out one year for a Mother's Day brunch with my goddaughter and her family and my mother, and she's someone who's really been someone who I've personally admired, as well as, you know, the overall admiration for her. But Ms. Magazine being only one of the many things, the many touch points she has in this world. You also talk about the lawsuit at Newsweek magazine over gender equity, and Newsweek was my first professional job.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But
Me
when
too.
I was there, I learned nothing about it because people weren't talking about it. I was there in the early 90s, and it was just far enough away from that lawsuit, that gender integrated Newsweek magazine, that people weren't talking about it, but it was not far enough away that Lynn Povich's book had come out, you know, talking about that, which also became a TV show. So I was kind of in this trough. And Eleanor Holmes Norton was their lawyer, like so many amazing touch points. But talk about media and who gets to tell stories in real time, and how you tried to tell the story of the storytellers.
Well, I have to say I was so shocked by the media was all white. The mainstream media was white male. It was run by white men, and the reporters were, the editors were, the producers were, and they almost uniformly made fun of the women's movement and just thought they were ridiculous. I mean, when Ms. Magazine first published in January of 1972, I actually should remember exactly. I think it was Eric Severide went on and said, this is going to last for 1 month and no one's going to buy it. And of course, it sold out in a week and was a massive success. So they didn't get it. You know, there was just this, for example, in 1968, there's a chapter on the protest at the Miss America pageant. Mm-hmm. And in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and this was one of the first time the younger, more radical women got out there, and it was the first public protest of the movement, and it was covered widely by the press, but it was all as a joke, you know, that these people are freaks, essentially. And eventually they all had to come around to the fact that this was not a niche movement that was just run by lesbians who hated men, you know, that this was real. And so I quote throughout the book different moments where, you know, columnists and commentators just trash this movement, and it really struck me. Of course, there was an amazing underground press. I mean, there were about 500 underground women's liberation newspapers. So every city had them, and it was and that also, though, they have not been saved well enough and archived well enough. In fact, that would be a great project for the library, actually. I think Mr. Marks is here. To find these, like, Off Our Backs was a wonderful underground paper that started in around 1969, early on, and lasted for a long time, and was weekly, and they covered the NBFO, the great convention at Riverside Park of the National Black Feminist Organization. They also covered the women at the DNC in Miami in 1972, where Shirley Chisholm made her last great speech. And they were much more reliable than a lot of the other clips that I could find. But by 1972, new journalism had started. And so Germaine Greer was out there writing, and Nora Ephron was, and it was just the beginning of women being able to, and of course Ms. Magazine, being able to write. And Newsweek was also one of my first jobs.
Oh,
so
okay.
I started there in 1989, so a bit before you.
Yeah.
And I was a few years out of college. We both went to college at the same place, but 5 years apart. Farai's much younger than I am. But I got there and was in the Washington Bureau and got to cover the White House under Bush 1.
Wow.
And it was amazingly exciting, and I had no idea what had come before me. And then when I wrote about the Good Girls Revolt, which is the name of Lynn Povich's book about this, and also the TV series on Amazon, I interviewed Lynn, and I interviewed a woman named Lucy Howard, and both of them were very instrumental in the class action that 46 women at the magazine sued Newsweek, and with Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was their lawyer at the ACLU at the time. And not until I wrote this book did I know that Lynn, and I knew about Lynn later because of her book, but Lucy Howard, I filed stories to every single week.
Yeah.
And I had no idea until I wrote this book that she was the reason why I was there.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I didn't realize you had worked at Newsweek. I love it. This probably is someone else's housekeeping, but I know that there's going to be a system for getting questions for Clara. There should be little cards. So just telling you folks, I'm sure someone will work on that, but just want to give you the opportunity to start filling out your cards if you want to. So let's pull up two topics that are very much in the news today: abortion and who can be president. What does a president look like? And of course, we're gathered here on the day after a seminal debate. But starting with abortion, can you read us a little bit?
Yes. Almost everyone I interviewed, I asked if they had had an abortion, and shockingly, almost to a person, everyone had at least had one, and many more often. And the reason why was by the late 60s, there was a healthcare crisis. There was a perfect storm of the sexual revolution and very little access to birth control. Birth control was not legal, was not protected by the Constitution for single people until 1972.
Wow.
And it wasn't protected for married people in 1965 with Griswold v. Connecticut. So many of the women I interviewed would put on fake wedding rings and go to their doctor and try to get a prescription. The pill was put on the market in 1960, but it was also hard to get and very experimental, extremely high estrogen. A lot of people had terrible side effects. So there was no fix, and there were massive amounts of women dying. About 1,000 women a year died from illegal botched abortions. These are two different stories. The first is from Sally Roche Wagner. I got married in the blue suit that I had bought to go to Mills College. But of course, I couldn't go. I got pregnant right out of high school. This was 1960 in Aberdeen, South Dakota. There was no birth control available. When I went to get a pregnancy test, my mother asked our family doctor if he would consider giving me an abortion. The doctor was horrified. My mother took a risk asking, and in retrospect, I recognize that. I had to get married out of town with a former minister whose wife didn't think there should be any photographs of the wedding because it was a shameful moment. I was a fallen woman. I walked down the aisle and I couldn't stop crying. I just remember walking down, being supported by my father because I was wearing high heels. I'd never worn them before and I couldn't stand up myself. I was literally transferred from my father to my husband. It wasn't lost on me that I couldn't stand up for myself. I wept because all of my possibilities were gone.
Yeah.
Here's another woman, Frances Beale, who told me this story. I had my first abortion when I was 17. I was still in high school. My boyfriend and later husband, Jimmy, arranged it. It was a backstreet abortion on the kitchen table. It was horrible because I started bleeding and I was bleeding. And so Jimmy had enough sense to take me to the hospital. We bought a ring and pretended we were married, and they wanted to know, are you married? You should tell us. Did you do anything? You need to tell us if you did anything. We want to know. Jimmy had told me no matter what they say, don't admit that you had had an abortion. It was completely illegal. They could put me in jail. I was put in a ward with a lot of other women who had gone through grim, botched abortions. Some of them were yelling. I remember a doctor saying to one of the young girls, easier going up than coming out, huh?
Yep. Just
Yep.
complete disrespect.
Yep.
And you have a lot of material on abortion in this book that makes it clear what the stakes were, and there were also people who formed alliances and collectives. So talk about Jane.
So Jane was an amazing group of women in Chicago. Most of them were part of the Chicago Women's Liberation Organization. And they started an underground abortion network. The first person who started it was a woman named Heather Booth, who had worked at SNCC and also in SDS. She was had been an activist. She was a student at University of Chicago. A friend of hers had a girlfriend who needed an abortion, and she found a civil rights doctor to give it to her safely, and that started a just flood of calls. And she started receiving calls on her dorm hallway phone and asked everyone to just ask for Jane. And the numbers got to be so large that she enlisted her friends in her group, and they, over the years, became extremely organized. And they had a hierarchy. Most people didn't know what was happening. They had, people who answered the phones, people who were the drivers, and they had several doctors they could trust, and women started coming from all over the Midwest to Chicago. They even advertised in newspapers, need an abortion, ask Jane, and then there was a phone number. So they were infamous, and eventually, which was really amazing, and by 1970, the doctor that they relied on, they discovered, was not an MD. He had been trained by the mob, by the mafia, which was a common thing. The mafia had a sort of underground abortion racket going. And so they thought, if he's not really a doctor and he can do this safely, they trusted him, maybe we can too. And so a bunch of them apprenticed with him. And maybe about a dozen learned how to perform abortions themselves. And they performed over 11,000 abortions by the time they got busted in 1972. They were called the Abortion Seven, and they all faced about 10 years of jail time. But Roe v. Wade passed before they went to trial, and they were released. But they are amazing heroes.
I know, it's an amazing arc of history, catching up with.
Yeah. I wonder if there are any Janes out there in Texas or Alabama.
Yeah. And abortion, as should not be shocking, came up last night in the debate. And we are no longer living in a Roe world, but in a Dobbs world. History is making a hyperloop, and we still don't know what will happen next. But I want to move on to the question of the presidency. Vice President Kamala Harris is the first Black and South Asian woman to be on a major party ticket at the head of the ticket, but she's not the first Black woman to run for president. So let's talk a little bit about Shirley Chisholm. One of the things that I really, that I hadn't heard about her before was that she spoke fluent Spanish, and she used that to campaign when she was running for Congress, you know, one of her many skills. And she was pretty much reviled by some of the Black leadership, by men who couldn't deal with her power. But who was she, and what does it mean to look at her legacy today in light of where we are with Vice President Harris?
Well, I mean, she really was the first person to break through this incredibly hard barrier of being a Black female presidential candidate. And she was so powerfully strong. She was a school teacher for a long time, but just loved politics and lived in Brooklyn, lived in Bed-Stuy, and worked in the party machinery, doing what women did, which was lots of petitioning and back office stuff. And then she actually first ran for the state legislature and won. And then the first majority Black district in Brooklyn was created. And she, against everyone who she worked with, mostly the men, ran for it and won. And it was she got the women a lot of their. It was a real melting pot of a district, and she went door to door. Had very little money, but had incredible dignity and humor and charisma. And she wore a wig. She always wore very, very fancy clothes, and took herself seriously, but had a great sense of humor. And when she got to Congress, she faced unbelievably horrific misogyny and racism. There were only 10 Black members of Congress out of 535 in 1969. So this was just 4 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed, and there were 11 women. So that's how, how white male Congress was. And a lot of the Southerners didn't want her to be there. So on her first day, she went to the members' dining room, brought her tray, went to an empty table, and a Southern gentleman came up to her and said, excuse me, this is the Georgia delegation table. And she said, well, thank you, please join me for lunch. And he said, no, this is the Georgia delegation table, meaning you need to leave and go to the New York table, which was full, apparently. And she sat and ate alone.
Yeah.
There are many more stories like that, but then when she decided to run, which was, out of the blue, both the Black Congressional Caucus and the Women's Political Caucus, National Women's Political Caucus, she had helped form both of those and founded them, didn't endorse her because they knew she didn't have a chance of winning, and they were in the business of trying to achieve some political power. So she felt very betrayed by her colleagues, but forged ahead and was just so modern. She had her staff in Congress was called the Chisettes. And they were multiracial, and she was like, I had the UN, working for me, and she had everyone working for her in the 8 states where she was on the ballot, and also it was the first year that people could vote at age 18. It used to be 21. And she really appealed to the younger people who were fighting against Vietnam at the time and were very disillusioned by the mainstream political, Nixon was president. It was a really disillusioning time. And she brought so many people back into the system. And one of my favorite stories is Barbara Lee was a young woman on welfare, 2 children, and was at Mills College, and she was head of the Black Student Union. She invited Shirley Chisholm to come speak, and didn't even know she was running for president. And Shirley Chisholm said, why don't you work for me on my campaign, but first you have to register to vote. And Barbara Lee is like, why would I do that? Why would I be interested in voting? It was 5 white men were, in the primary, and she couldn't relate to any of them. Of course, she registered. She worked really hard for Shirley, and she became a member of Congress. She served 13 years representing Oakland. So she inspired so many people to realize that, you can do this. Even, she helped people of every color and gender, and also she was very advanced about LGBTQ issues as well. She was just an amazing woman.
Yeah.
And she, only got 2.7% of the vote in the end. But she made it all the way through the primaries, and I just want to read this one section. When she gets to Miami and it's time for her to give her speech, this is what she wrote in her memoir. When I got to the convention hall, it was lit up by noise. That was a wonderful moment for me to see the way all the delegates received me at the convention, because I'd felt that someday a black person or a female person should run for the presidency of the United States. And now I was a catalyst for change.
It's just inspiring. So I want to move on to questions from the audience. I apologize, there are many more questions than we have time for, but I will do my best to select a few. This one says, I had the privilege to work for the Honorable Bella Abzug in Congress. Could you please share some thoughts on her impact?
Amazing, that's you. So I have to point out my agent, Esther Newberg, who was her Bella's first chief of staff, and who is quoted also in this book. When did you work for Bella?
January 1976, after graduating in women's studies at Cornell from the Labor Relations School. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's book on such discrimination law was my textbook for that. And I covered the Supreme Court hearings for her, for whether disability could be included for pregnancy. And we lost in the Supreme Court, and within 2 years, Congress changed the law.
With ADA. Yeah. No.
Changed the laws, Title
For
VII,
okay.
to include pregnancy for disability.
Okay. Amazing.
To include that. And then I worked on her campaign, and I was rather disenchanted and then went into sports. Gloria Steinem was thrilled to hear when I went into baseball.
Amazing.
Wow,
I love it. I love it. Now, Bella was great.
Right, she was a civil rights lawyer. And she
Yes.
so
Yeah. So she earned her stripes and gained her conscience as a civil rights lawyer, and she then ran for Congress in 1970, and was an absolute powerhouse. She initially really was. She was very anti-war, and she was a peace activist as well, and that motivated a lot. But she was also politically astute and really knew how to play, behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, and was an absolute powerhouse and coalition builder. And she and Gloria Steinem were important political partners, and they tangled a lot with Betty Friedan, who was quite jealous of their partnership.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Now, this one I found fascinating. Did any of your subjects, in retrospect, change their opinion of what happened during the movement?
I think some of them had regrets. I think there was a sense that there were fringe parts of the movement that went really far out. I interviewed several women who were part of something called the Furies, that was a collective, a radical lesbian collective and commune in Washington. And in order to join and live there, you had to give up your children. And I interviewed a few of the women who did do that, and it was wrenching for them. And also that some of them realized that extreme sort of anti-male, anti-child, anti-family attitude that was not common, but it was definitely part of the fringe parts of the movement, hurt them politically. And this was something Betty Friedan, on a much more conservative level, was very worried about. I mean, she did not want the lesbians and now to come out. She felt that her idea was, I don't care what you do in your private life, but we don't need to know about it, and this is going to hurt the movement. And she was rebelled against and had to back down eventually because it was such a hypocritical thing to do. But she was just thinking about the press coverage they were getting and how to attract mainstream women from the suburbs and how to make this a mass movement. And so the women on the fringe, some of them, were pretty clear about how, that was a stage of my life. And it was interesting to hear why they got to that stage.
Yeah.
And in context, it made sense. But some of them had regrets about it.
Yeah. What do you see usurping feminist progress today? What are the ways in which you imagine women and men can galvanize to further women's liberation?
I think we both get to answer that question, because you probably have just as much to say about it as I would.
Put me on the spot. Well, I mean, I think this is very personal, as well as I think universal to a lot of people. But I've been doing some caregiving for my mother, who has dementia, and I think that the ways in which the American political and economic system does not value caregiving, whether it's caring for children, caring for parents, or caring for yourself, is toxic and hits women hardest. So if we can begin to structure caregiving, resources for caregiving that are both financial and social. That was one thing that I was waiting to see. Like, there's a number of polls from people like Celinda Lake, who's a well-known Democratic pollster, that show that caregiving is an issue that people are deeply attached to in the political sphere. It also came out recently in a poll by the 19th, a women's news organization. But caregiving didn't come up in the debate last night, and it doesn't come up. If you think about the Affordable Care Act, if we had some progress in the public sphere, in government, but as well in just a broader set of vectors in American life, that would make life better, I think, for so many Americans. And we're going to be seeing, as people from the baby boom generation continue to retire, I think we're going to see a lot of people in distress because they lack the resources for care, whether it's the financial resources or the networks and organizations that can add to care. So for me, what would help women's movements today, but also just men and everybody, is more resources for care, more structured resources for care.
And childcare as well.
Oh, absolutely.
There was an important mega childcare bill, which Bella Abzug spearheaded with Shirley Chisholm together, that passed in both houses of Congress and went to President Nixon in 1971, and he vetoed it.
Oh my gosh, I had no idea.
And it's always been a moment. Nothing like that bill has ever come through Congress since. And a lot of the women I talked to felt that that was one of the huge failures of this movement, because they ended up focusing on the ERA so much. It was so all-encompassing from really 1972 until 1982, when it didn't when it didn't pass enough states to be ratified. So that because the thought was if we could just pass the ERA, that would be a silver bullet. But losing out on childcare, and we're still in the same spot where we don't even have paid, leave.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really primitive.
Yeah.
And I hope if Kamala Harris wins, I think that would be one of her. I mean, she's already said she took care of her mother when when her mother had dementia, when she was the DA of San Francisco, and then she had the neighbor who helped take care of her and her sister when her mother was working.
Yeah.
So she may be the first president who would have any kind of firsthand experience with caregiving.
Yeah. What about you on the same question? What can further the movement?
I think that young people organizing for women's issues, like now that we have reproductive care on the ballot in all of these states, and it's become so clear. So many, I think the younger generation, of course, as we did, took choice for granted, and that now there is such an existential threat to women, and also any age and stage of women of childbearing years, that this is the moment for women to really start organizing for women's rights in a way that they haven't done in 50 years.
Yeah.
So that's what I hope for.
Absolutely. All right, we probably have time for one or two more questions. This one is a bit of a provocation because it's good, but just a question of whether you agree with it or not. Why did the women's movement stagnate after the mid-1970s? Do you agree that it stagnated, and if so, why?
I think I would agree with that, and that it stagnated partly because it had achieved a lot by then, and it also started fracturing. There was a lot of infighting. There was and mostly the backlash began, and that backlash went throughout the 80s. And I mentioned Phyllis Schlafly near the end of the book because she rears her head when she realizes the ERA would be a very opportunistic political issue for her to take on. And she was a brilliant political strategist, and she destroyed the ERA, just single-handedly almost. And I consider her the first trad wife.
Yes, it's so true.
First one. 6 children.
Yep.
Worked full time, of course.
Yep.
But
She was working so other women didn't have to.
Yeah, exactly. It really, there wasn't, it's partly why I ended the book in 1973. A lot of, because I felt like that was really the height of the movement. And a lot of important things went on in 75 and 76. And the movement also became more internationally focused, which was a very important kind of second stage.
Yeah. And I think we'll have to end it here. So this question is, can you compare and contrast feminism today versus during the period in your book, The Movement, and what the future of feminism will look like in the next 10 years?
Oh my God.
So I know we could spend another hour on that.
Okay. I guess
you could focus on the next 10 years part if you want. I'm just curious where you think things are headed.
Well, I mean, I think besides the issue of choice, we're doing really well, and look who is running for president and who is being taken seriously in a real way and has real respect. And even 10 years ago, that would have seemed, unheard of. And we now have a record number of women in Congress. I think that we're up to 151, and still only 10% of CEOs are women. So that's, there's still ways to go there. But I think that it's the pendulum goes like this and then it goes back. It's hard. I think that misogyny is a very, very powerful and primal feeling, or whatever we would call it. I think it's very strong and unconscious for a lot of people, and I think that's what women are up against. And I also think that until we can figure out childcare and how to take care of families and also work, there will always be a ceiling on how far women can go in terms of achieving public power, you know?
Well, this was fantastic. Can we get a round of applause for Clara Bingham? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And your book, The Movement, you'll be signing copies outside.
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
So please feel free to remember all of your relatives. Christmas is coming up and Hanukkah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Christmas, Hanukkah, birthdays, the movement.
Birthdays, yes.
It is really extraordinary. I got so much out of it. So thank you again, Clara.
Thank you.